Ladies and gentlemen, one of the great benefits of presidential oral history is that it illuminates not only the president, but of those who worked with him as well. On the global stage, perhaps no one was closer to Ronald Reagan than Brian Mulroney. As Reagan's former executive assistant, Jim Kuhn, summarized during his oral history interview at the Miller Center, he said, "Two Irishmen, very fond of one another, close relationship." Of Mulroney, Kuhn added, "I loved being around him. He'd come up, ask you how you were, knew your name, ask how the family was, how things were going, put his arm around you. Just a wonderful man, delightful man." Nice to see that some things never change. But the relationship between President Reagan and Mr. Mulroney extended far beyond their Irish roots and provides a great case study on the impact of friendship in foreign policy. One of the more interesting stories we heard in our oral history interviews came from Frank Carlucci, who served as National Security Advisor and later as Secretary of Defense. Carlucci recalled a trip to Ottawa to meet with Mulroney and his advisors. Listen to what Carlucci said. As Reagan's limousine came up, he motioned to me to come in and sit down. He said, "I think we ought to do something for Brian." I said, "Mr. President, we're doing well holding our positions on acid rain, the free trade agreement, and the Northwest Passage. At the time, we'd been having intense negotiations." "Oh, no, we ought to do something," the President said. So at lunch, Derek Burney, Mulroney's chief of staff, and I started passing notes. Burney was trying to negotiate over the lunch table with these notes, and I would send notes back saying, "No, no." Mulroney was a smooth operator, and he said, quote, "I can see there's some staff discussion going on here. Maybe, Mr. President, you and your staff would like to regroup. Why don't you go into the other room?" We went into the sitting room, Carlucci said. I'll never forget it. George Shultz was sitting to Ronald Reagan's left. I was sitting to his right on the couch. There were some other people in the room. Howard Baker was there. George said something like, "We need to accommodate Mulroney more." I said, No, we're holding to our positions. These are well-established positions." It was the only time I saw Ronald Reagan lose his temper. He turned to me and said, "You do it." So I marched out of the room, grabbed Derek Burney. I said, "Derek, come out on the porch." He sat down on the porch, and I said, "Derek, would you reiterate your positions? Because now they're our positions." Not bad to have friends in high places. We are thankful to Mr. Mulroney for joining us today and hope to hear some of his own recollections of his very special relationship. We're also thankful to have with us today Frederick J Ryan Jr., who has served as chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation since 1995. Fred had the pleasure of serving President Reagan for many years, beginning in February 1982 as Deputy Director of Presidential Appointments and Scheduling. He went on to become Director of Presidential Appointments and Scheduling, and in 1985 began working in the White House Office of Private Sector Initiatives. In 1987, President Reagan personally appointed him to be assistant to the President. After the President left office, Fred served as Chief of Staff to President Reagan from 1989 to 1995, and his recollections from that period remain one of the more illuminating interviews from our oral history project. In addition to his role at the Reagan Foundation, he serves as Vice Chairman of All Britain Communications Company and President and CEO of Politico.com. After lunch, Fred will introduce our keynote speaker, but first, enjoy your meals. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as everyone enjoys their desserts, I would like to take a moment on behalf of the Reagan Presidential Foundation to convey our gratitude to Governor Baliles and the Miller Center at the University of Virginia for partnering with us on this wonderful conference over the last 2 days. Thank you so much, Governor. This symposium on Reagan in the world is part of a series of events at major universities across America that are taking place in connection with the centennial of Ronald Reagan. And as you may have seen, the Reagan Centennial celebration began last Sunday on Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday, or what he probably would have described as the 61st anniversary of his 39th birthday. And the purpose of the centennial is not so much to look back, but really to look forward. And President Reagan made it clear from the time his library opened and the foundation was established that it should not just be about the success of the past, but more about the promise of the future. And today is particularly relevant, his legacy, that of civility and respect. While yes, he held deep core beliefs, he fought hard, he played to win, and he did his utmost to defeat his opponents, but never to destroy them. And at the end of the day, he showed that he could get together with his political adversaries in an atmosphere of goodwill and mutual respect. And the country was served well for that. Over the course of this centennial year, there will be statue unveilings and ceremonies here in Washington at Reagan National Airport, to Grosvenor Square in London, Prague, Budapest, across Eastern Europe, where Ronald Reagan is known not just as the great communicator, but also as the great liberator. And we all know that Ronald Reagan benefited from a close alliance with a core group of like-minded, gifted world leaders. Included were Margaret Thatcher of England, from the Vatican, Pope John Paul II, and our speaker today, the 18th Prime Minister of Canada, Brian Mulroney. He was elected Prime Minister by a history-making margin in 1984. Upon assuming office, Brian Mulroney almost instantly became President Reagan's valued partner and close friend. And I know both men have referred to their friendship over the years in speeches and in private conversations and in their memoirs. But one of my favorite insights into their relationship is in the diary entry President Reagan made on the day they met for the first time. And as I think, as you know, he kept this diary, and it was not intended for publication. It was not intended for posterity to correct any records or set anybody straight. It was for his own personal use. These were his personal thoughts that he recorded each day at the end of the day. Well, he wrote on that day he met Brian Mulroney, "I'm back in the Oval Office, meeting with the new Prime Minister Mulroney of Canada. He has just won a wonderful victory. He is a super fellow." Together, the two North American leaders worked their Irish magic on fellow heads of state around the world. After a hard day of negotiations at an economic summit, which President Reagan and the Prime Minister had successfully partnered on an important global initiative, President Reagan again wrote in his diary, quote, "Our dinner that night was heads of state only. Instead of business, we got into storytelling. Brian Mulroney started it. And I got on with some, and a good time was had by all." But the President and the Prime Minister didn't just make stories. They made history. Maybe nothing so much as establishing a new and better way of doing business here on this continent. President Reagan had long dreamed of the establishment of what he called a North American Accord in relation with our neighbors, a new era of cooperation and openness. With Brian Mulroney at the head of the Canadian government, that dream became a reality. They produced the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. In 1988, it was expanded under Prime Minister Mulroney's second term into the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Well, it's clear that this milestone example of free trade could not have happened without Brian Mulroney's leadership and vision. So, ladies and gentlemen, a great Prime Minister of Canada and a great friend of Ronald Reagan, the Right Honorable Brian Mulroney.
Well, thank you, Fred, very much. And as I was indicating at the table, Ronald Reagan was fortunate in having associates and friends like Fred Ryan to carry on the fight even after he went to that great political rally in the sky. And Fred has done, as you could see on Sunday in television, he's done a marvelous job with the Reagan Foundation and the library. And so I'm delighted to hook up with him again after all of these years. Alors, chers amis, mesdames et messieurs, distingués invités, ladies and gentlemen, Governor, thank you for having me and thank you for the kind words. And Jeff, thank you for all your work in putting this together and in having me down from the cold north to come to a nice cold Washington. You know, when I listen to Fred, it reminds me that interesting things happen, you know, when you leave office. Every time I come to the United States now for a speaking engagement, I think of the first time I did that. And right after I resigned, I was going to Orlando for an engagement. We got caught in a big snowstorm and we got diverted to Detroit. You talk about lucky. When I got off the plane, I head out, and there's a woman from the Special Services of Northwest Airlines right there. And she says, Prime Minister Mulroney, you go right over there, and there's an electric cart that'll take you to the other end of the airport, and you'll make a connecting flight immediately for Orlando. I said, well, thank you very much. And I head over to the cart, which is being guarded by a guy about 6'5", 280 pounds, 19 years old. He looks like a linebacker for the Detroit Lions. And he's guarding it. And just as I arrive, a woman who's behind me charges in front and says to him, I have to have that cart right now. And he says, you cannot have that cart. And she says, why not? And he says, because this cart is reserved for the former dictator from Canada. God, how quickly they forget. You know, there's a lot of talk about my friendship with President Reagan, which of course was entirely legit and accurate. But, you know, when I did things, some of my opponents in Canada, and I can mention them because I had so few, that some of them say, well, you know, Mulroney loves the Americans so much, he simply wants to make Canada the 51st state. He wants to be the governor of the 51st state. And I used to tell them, no, there's some fundamental differences between Canada and the United States. For example, in August of 1987, President Reagan and I were at the G7 summit in Venice. And this was the summer of the Iran Contra hearings in Washington. And it was the first time that I saw President Reagan not depressed, but somewhat morose, because he would listen to these hearings on CNN. There was only CNN in those days. He would listen to them on CNN and then come to the meetings really quite upset. So after a couple of days of this, I said, Ron, you know, do not watch CNN. Watch Bonanza, you know, anything. And he said, well, Brian, yeah, but you don't understand. You're going to see that this is having a terrible impact on me and, you know, in my administration and so on. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, about 10 days later, I guess, I was back at the Prime Minister's summer residence at Harrington Lake, and I picked up the Sunday New York Times, and Reagan was right. Right there in big black headlines on the front page was a headline, Reagan's popularity plummets to 59%. And right then I knew the difference between Canadians and Americans. It's language. The word plummet clearly does not mean the same thing in Canada as it does in the United States. But knowing Reagan, I know that how he'd feel about this. So I called him up, and he was at Camp David. And as soon as he heard my voice, he said, and I said, well, how are you doing, Ron? He said, oh, just awful, Brian. He said, I guess you've seen that bloody poll. I said, Ron, I don't know how to break this to you. But on a good day, Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, and I combined don't have a 59% approval rating. But I understand, Mr. Chairman, that this conference is really all about remembering Ronald Reagan, his presidency, and the manner in which he changed the world. Many of you knew Ronald Reagan longer and better than me. Some of you worked with him daily for years and bring that unique insight to these deliberations. I knew him as a fellow G7 leader with whom I shared moments of high drama on the world stage during one of the most explosive decades in modern history. We became friends, and I saw him often, very often, when questions of world peace or war were being determined. In that most scalding of political cauldrons, I observed Ronald Reagan closely. And that is the perspective that I will try to share with you today. Some years ago, the legendary New York Times columnist Scotty Reston came to lunch with me at 24 Sussex, the Prime Minister's official residence in Ottawa. After an impressive tour d'horizon, Mr. Reston said, you know, Prime Minister, for the last 25 years, I have opposed every single policy that your friend Ronald Reagan has ever stood for. And then he added, and during that same period, Ronald Reagan was twice elected governor of California and twice elected president of the United States. This self-deprecatory observation I thought memorable because of its infrequency in the New York Times, was delivered somewhat ruefully, as if Mr. Reston were perplexed by his own admission. But to so wise an observer as Reston, the answer surely should have been very clear. It's called leadership, that ineffable and sometimes magical quality that sets some men and women apart so that millions will follow them as they conjure up new visions and invite their countrymen to dream big and exciting dreams. In his seminal work on leadership, James McGregor Burns segregates transactional from transformational leadership. He writes that it is the transforming leader who raises the level of human conduct of both leader and led, who responds to fundamental hopes and expectations, and who may transcend and even seek to reconstruct the political system rather than simply operate within it. You know, many people suggest that great, inexorable currents of history themselves, and not individual leaders, seal our fate. In my judgment, however, Carlyle was on target when he observed that the right man in the right place at the right time can completely change the course of history. I believe this to be true because I was there to see it happen. In a brilliant address delivered some years ago in Canada, Ted Sorensen, himself a skilled observer of powerful leaders, said, "Once in office, those who wish to stand up and stand out and leave something enduring behind must build new institutions, not new images. They must look to the next generation, not merely the next election. They must talk in terms of fundamental values, not merely costs. They must appeal to our hopes as well as our needs, to what we long to be and what we know is right." That, he said, is leadership. Does this remind you of anybody? Now, if today you ask the American people if they think Ronald Reagan was a transforming president or simply a transactional one, what do you think they would reply? Look around you, they would say. The Reagan Revolution and its positive and powerful effects on freedom and economic prosperity in the private sector and the public good are clearly visible both in contemporary America and in world history. President Reagan's personal qualities defined his presidency, in my judgment, in very interesting ways. One day, during a G7 meeting in Tokyo, he and I were off having lunch together, which we often did, as Jim and the others know. And we had a discussion of leading personalities while having lunch, and I asked him, I said, "Ron, who do you really dislike in American politics?" He thought for a moment, looked at me quizzically, and said, "You know, Brian, I just can't think of one at the moment. I'm fixated on what looks like an eagle in my soup." This was a very disconcerting answer for any Canadian Prime Minister who, on his best days, has more adversaries than friends, and who can clearly remember every insult or slight from any opponent since his 14th birthday. In fact, I thought that in some countries, President Reagan's generous detachment of attitude in politics would probably be unconstitutional. Nevertheless, under my insistent interrogation, President Reagan finally identified a former associate, no one in this room, as someone he actually disliked. This display of vindictiveness on his part made me feel better and partially restored my faith in the American political process. To be fully serious, however, I noted that because of this most unusual absence of malice, President Reagan's judgments were unaffected by the pettiness and mean-spiritedness that tend to make in politics good intentions bad and tough situations worse. He never sought to get even with anybody except by the triumph of his ideas. He struck me as a leader more interested in healing old wounds than in settling old scores. In consequence, his true nature and sunny personality came through to the American people, who reveled in the choice of a president who clearly made public policy not for easy headlines in 10 days, but for a better America in 10 years. I also thought that President Reagan's understanding of the nobility of the presidency coincided with the American dream. One day in Brussels, following a NATO meeting, President Mitterrand of France, in referring to Ronald Reagan, said to me, Tu sais, Brian, called me Brian, notre ami Ronald Reagan, as he called guess who, a vraiment la notion de l'État. Rough translation. You know, Brian, our friend Ronald Reagan really has a sense of the state about him. The translation does not fully capture the profundity of the observation. What Mitterrand meant was that there is a vast difference between the job of president and the role of president. In fact, many people can do the job. Few, however, fully grasp that unusual alchemy of history and tradition and achievement and personal conduct and national pride that define the special role the U.S. president must assume at home and around the world. La notion de l'État. No one understood it better than Ronald Reagan, and no one could more eloquently summon his nation to high purpose or bring forth the majesty of the presidency and make it glow better than the man who saw his own country as a shining city on a hill. Ronald Reagan's mature attitude to life while in office, I thought as well, framed his presidency forever. President Kennedy captivated America and the world 50 years ago last month in large measure because of the excitement and promise of his youth. From that day on, the celebration of youth in public life was overpowering and pervasive. It was also somewhat misleading. But around the world, presidents and prime ministers in their 30s and 40s proliferated. If you were young, you were smart. You had brilliant ideas. You knew sophisticated and talented people and could conquer the world. Suddenly, if you were older, you were quaint and pretty well out of business, or so it seemed. I myself came to office at age 45 after a pretty solid career in law and business and life generally. But when the hostile battering and the unremitting personal attacks began soon thereafter by the opposition, the media, and interest groups, I can recall from time to time being left uncertain or undecided about a particular important course of action to have my government follow. Ronald Reagan came to the presidency at age 70. His principles were tested and firm. His ideas were clearly developed and straightforward. His attitude was good-natured and self-assured. He had thought his way carefully through America's challenges and solutions and was both relaxed and resolute in addressing both. He was, as the French say, bien dans sa peau, comfortable in his own skin. That was one principal reason why, having made all of the major policy decisions himself, he felt no hesitation or insecurity at delegating the implementation to a group of strong aides and cabinet secretaries who surrounded him throughout his time in office. He could also weather a debilitating recession, cause a huge firestorm by firing all of Patco, label the Soviet Union an evil empire, launch military strikes against terrorism halfway around the world, propose SDI, and withstand all of the criticism without changing course or missing a nap. How do you like that? Because he could care less what the Washington Post or the New York Times or anyone else said. He was 70 years old, and he had seen it all before. His imperturbability, while at the vortex of great protest and convulsive change, demonstrated that he had become a leader who was unshakable in his pursuit of fundamental policies because they reflected his own beliefs and his own values. And this had resulted from a full life's work. In my judgment, this reality was not an insignificant factor in the huge success of the Reagan presidency. Ronald Reagan personified the optimism and confidence of America to Americans and to the world. He bolstered the spirit of America. He restored national strength and the ability to succeed. I can tell you this, the word malaise was not part of his vocabulary. Even those who didn't agree with him, and they were legion, respected Ronald Reagan because he was unwavering in what he believed was right for America. No ambiguity, no deception, no cynicism. What you saw or heard was precisely what Ronald Reagan meant. From time to time, I recorded thoughts and impressions in a private journal or memoirs following major events or particularly interesting occurrences. I share with you today a few brief entries in which I describe the Ronald Reagan I saw and knew from working with him beginning some 27 years ago. When I was just the leader of the opposition, I met him. And here's what I wrote a couple of hours later. During the meeting yesterday, I was struck by the president's remarkably youthful manner. This was in 1984, towards the end of his first term. His sense of humor and, strange to say, feeling of serenity. He seemed calm and composed, solicitous of others, and very much in command. We discussed arms control negotiations, acid rain, steel imports, and methods of better managing our relationship. I had been told to expect that after a few comments, others would take over the discussion on his behalf. The meeting lasted 45 minutes, and he was the vigorous and lone American participant from beginning to end. He was humorous and courteous throughout. He listened carefully and politely as I made some pretty vigorous pleas on behalf of the Canadian position on issues. My impression was that if this were not an election year, responses to our views might be more prompt and accommodating. I dwelt at some length on the peace issue and said that Canadians would regard it as an indication of strength, not weakness, if he took further initiatives to induce and persuade the Soviets back to the bargaining table. He said that he had had no response at all from the Soviets and referred to a handwritten letter that he had sent General Secretary Andropov from the hospital, to which there had been no response. I don't even know if they got it, he said. And at the end of the meeting, he said, "Brian, let me know if there's anything we can do. Don't go to Ireland again without me." After the Shamrock Summit, the following year in Quebec City, I wrote the following. Our first round of private talks ended with Reagan telling some of his famous stories. Chuckling throughout, he regaled his listeners with the story of the time men from separate American and British units found themselves in the same pub one day in England during the Second World War. As the British soldiers hoisted ales in honor of the king, the brash Americans returned a toast of their own. "Screw the king," the Americans said. Surprised, the Brits again held up their beers. "Screw the president," they answered. And at that point, the American soldiers chimed in, "We'll drink to that." That wasn't the only occasion Reagan had me laughing during his visit. In his memoirs, Ronald Reagan in Private, the president's very able executive assistant, Jim Kuhn, who's here today. I didn't know you'd be here, Jim, but by God, I'm glad I put this in. Later described another Shamrock Summit Reaganism that helps to explain why Reagan was such a beloved leader. Quote, "Both leaders were scheduled to speak at an event which required Mulroney and Reagan to walk into the event together. Kuhn then wrote, but I earnestly explained to them that protocol dictated that they wait until the others in the U.S. and Canadian delegations had taken their places in the room first, which seemed to be taking a long time. Reagan looked at Mulroney and grinned. "Brian," he said, "it's protocol. Spelled bullshit." Nancy will forgive me for that one. When we discussed Reagan's approach to taxation and deficits, I was able to glimpse the brilliant politician that lay behind Reagan's sunny smile. The president said he planned to take his deficit-fighting plans directly to the American people. "What about Congress?" I said. "It's not necessary," Reagan replied, "to make Congress see the light, just to feel the heat." After that long series of meetings, after some 10 hours in his working presence, Reagan gives me this impression: he is a kindly man. This was written 26 years ago. He is a kindly man, possessed of a warm good humor, generous instincts, and what appears to be a total absence of malice. He speaks ill of no one. At meetings, Reagan starts off and speaks to the main issues. He is clearly in command, but defers easily to subordinates for details. They do not intrude on the discussions unless he asks them to. He is ready with a friendly quip or allusion. When I read him my notes of my meeting with Gorbachev in Moscow 10 days earlier, I had met Gorbachev the day he became leader of the Soviet Union, and conveyed my impressions to Reagan, who had never met him before. And I was conveying to him what I told Gorbachev. I had told Gorbachev that Reagan had the strength at home to make peace abroad. Reagan's eyes welled up. He seems deeply appreciative of small acts of friendship and truly grateful for kind words in defense of the United States. He recognizes that this may cause me difficulty in some quarters in Canada. These are the Looney Tunes and country who didn't support me. You can imagine how few there were those. But he is clearly moved by my straightforward declaration that I intend to give the United States the benefit of the doubt. For my part, the President strikes me, as he has for some years, as one who has been persistently underestimated by the trendy commentators and analysts. He is a shrewd judge of people and character. A deeply religious man, he appears free from theories. His views are simple and sound, rooted in proven results and not uncompromising virtue. Ronald Reagan may, 100 years from now, be revered as a truly great president because he made America feel good about itself again, made it throw off its self-doubt accrued from Vietnam to Watergate, and become a more proud and unsullied nation, capable of providing strong leadership at home and around the world. He really grasps the big picture. And then finally, just prior to Ronald Reagan's departure, I had lunch with him and Nancy, Neil and four of us, on the Truman balcony of the White House over here, and I jotted just this little note. Ronald Reagan has been for me a good ally and a trusted associate in international affairs. He is a deeply honorable man, unfailingly courteous and sensitive, with strongly held, straightforward views. And he has been a remarkable success as president and around the world, and a powerful friend to Canada. The impact of significant public policy decisions is often unclear in the early years. It sometimes takes a considerable period, frequently decades, before the full consequences of an important initiative become apparent. As Reinhold Niebuhr reminded us, nothing worth doing is completed in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. And nothing fine or beautiful or good makes any complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. On this 100th anniversary of President Reagan's birth, and 23 years, I believe, after he left office, some early judgments, however, are appropriate. The world was a very different place when Ronald Reagan took office in 1981 from when he left it in 1989, and worlds apart from what it has become since. Leonid Brezhnev then ruled the 15 republics of the Soviet Empire, a vast federation in some decline, but still powerful and aggressive and hostile, with nuclear missiles pointed at Washington, New York, London and Paris and Bonn. Cold War tensions prevailed and regional conflicts abounded. The Soviets refused to discuss arms control at Geneva, even as they became embroiled in regional wars from Afghanistan to Africa, with Mr. Khrushchev's threat to the West that we shall bury you, and conducted themselves as the Soviets did, with a swagger that meant clearly this was only a matter of time. Some in the West, during the early 80s, believing that both systems, communism and democracy, were equally valid and viable, advocated a policy of live and let live. Others, while deploring the tragic human injustices and economic flaws inherent in the Soviet system, saw it as a country with much more powerful and successful than it really was, and viewed it as worthy at least of Western tolerance, if not muted praise. Well, in contrast, Ronald Reagan saw communism as an insidious menace to be contained, challenged, and confronted, in the genuine belief that its underpinnings of brute force, destruction of individual liberties, and widespread moral decay would fall swiftly to the gathering winds of freedom and the shining achievements of democracy, provided, as he said, that NATO and the Western industrialized democracies stood firm and united. They did. And now we know who was right. Ronald Reagan's role as a peacemaker has been long underreported. From the evolution of his relationship with President Gorbachev and the beneficial results that ensued, to his willingness to share SDI with all interested partners, from his support of a renewed United Nations, to his opposition to the mutually assured destruction tenet of national security. As he wrote in his memoir, it was like having two Westerners standing in a saloon, aiming their guns at each other's head, permanently. There had to be a better way. President Reagan believed in a better way. He believed in peace through strength, and he delivered well beyond the dreams of many who were both skeptical and weary after years of tension and apprehension in a stultifying Cold War. Ronald Reagan knew the patronizing sneer of the political and the media elites. There was even a prominent lawyer in this town, here, a former cabinet officer on the other side of Reagan's coalition, who referred to President Reagan as, and I quote, an amiable dunce. So Reagan knew the patronizing sneer of the political and media elites. He didn't care. He knew the difference between simplistic and a powerful idea simply expressed. He read widely, he wrote beautifully, and absorbed the numbing policy briefings every leader has to endure. When it came to leading America, and sometimes the world, he was masterful at refining a complex policy challenge into a single, ringing sentence. None more memorable or historic in its impact than Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The wall came down because of Ronald Reagan, and with it came the implosion of an empire and the strong winds of freedom that swept dictators and totalitarianism alike from the face of Europe to the Urals and beyond. For Canada and the United States, the post-Cold War world offered unique opportunities and daunting challenges. We began from a common heritage of democratic traditions and a common defense of liberty. There are reminders of that from the trenches of one war to the beaches of the next. Places inscribed in the history of valor, where Canadians and Americans have fought together, where Canadians and Americans have died together in the defense of freedom. And because we have remained true to those values and had the courage and the strength to defend them over the decades in NATO and Korea and the Gulf and Afghanistan and elsewhere, within the last 2 decades, the Berlin Wall fell and Germany was reunited. A trade unionist from Gdansk became the president of Poland. A dissident poet sat in the castle in Prague as communist regimes tumbled like dominoes across Central and Eastern Europe. And in the Second Russian Revolution, the people of Moscow made a human wall around their parliament, and Soviet tanks that had crushed every single stirring of liberty for 70 years, now, for the first time, dared not cross. One could forgive President Reagan a small smile of satisfaction as one by one his ideas triumphed and his policies found permanent vindication. Some commentators smirked when, years ago, Ronald Reagan articulated a vision of a free trade zone that would stretch from Anchorage in Alaska all the way down to Tierra del Fuego on the southern tip of Latin America. As a new prime minister, in 1985, I signaled President Reagan that I was interested in negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States of America. And in 1987, following more than 2 years of negotiations, we concluded it, and he and I subsequently signed the massive and quite radical agreement which came into effect in January of 1989, which led to the largest trading relationship between any 2 countries in the history of the world. One of the results, for example, was that there is more trade across one border point, one bridge between Windsor, Ontario and Detroit, Michigan, more trade across one bridge than America trades with the nation of Japan. This is how enormous and complex and important our relationship is. And this is what was triggered by the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement. The Canada-USA Free Trade Agreement led to the creation of NAFTA by including Mexico. And one day, in the foreseeable future, this vast trading relationship shall embrace the entire hemisphere, 34 nations, 900 million people, and an annual GDP of $20 trillion a year, and another of Ronald Reagan's visionary dreams will have become reality. Not bad for an amiable dunce. Not bad. There remain, of course, daunting challenges for President Reagan's successors and mine, including the most challenging question of international terrorism. But I'm satisfied that on our watch, as he would say, we completed many of the essential tasks we took up, working for a safer world and preparing our people for the challenges of a new global economy. I believe, as President Reagan said in his address to the British Parliament, that we came safely through the worst. And that we did is due in very significant measure to the calm, confident, and poised leadership that Ronald Reagan offered to his country and to the world. In a special way, I am grateful for the enduring friendship between our 2 nations, described 70 years ago by Winston Churchill as that long frontier from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, guarded only by neighborly respect and honorable obligations, is an example to every country and a pattern for the future of the world. The relationship between Canada and the United States, so privileged and enhanced by President Ronald Reagan, remains a model to the world because for 200 years, our people have overcome differences and disagreements with goodwill and mutual respect and a sharp focus on those areas of common interest and shared objectives, providing a magnificent ongoing example of international comity and friendship and achievement for other nations in the world to follow. May our common future and that of our great nations be guided by wise men and women who will remember always the golden achievements of the Reagan era and the success that can be theirs if the values of freedom and democracy are preserved, unsullied, and undiminished until the unfolding decades can remember little else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for those moving remarks and for your wonderful and personal reflections upon your relationship with President Reagan. You haven't lost your touch, and fortunately, no one will have to follow your remarks here today. But we can sense from those comments the depth and breadth of your relationship with the President, and also sense why you were so successful as the leader of that coal nation to the north. Thank all of you for joining us for these sessions. It's been a wonderful honor for the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia to host and to participate in the organization of this conference and these illuminating discussions over the past 2 days. In a few weeks, as I mentioned earlier this morning, we will release a summary report of the entire conference proceedings. And later in the year, we will complete an edited volume on the lessons and legacy of the Reagan presidency in global affairs with contributions from the panelists of the past 2 days. Please be on the lookout for both of these publications. Full conference video can be found on our website, www.millercenter.org. I want to thank again Stuart McLaurin, the Executive Director of the Reagan Centennial Commission, as well as the Reagan Presidential Foundation, for their advice and assistance and cooperation and support of this conference. And finally, our deep and abiding thanks again to John and Rosemary Galbraith for their support of this conference, without which it would not have occurred, and for their deep and abiding support of the Miller Center of Public Affairs. At the 1988 Presidential Republican Convention, President Reagan said, quote, "When people tell me that I became president on January 20th, 1981, I feel I have to correct them. You don't become president of the United States. You are given temporary custody of an institution called the presidency, which belongs to our people. Having temporary custody of this office has been for me a sacred trust and an honor beyond words or measure," end of quote. It has been an honor as a part of this National Centennial Celebration for the Miller Center of Public Affairs to hold this gathering to reflect on Ronald Reagan's seminal influence. So on behalf of the Miller Center, thank you all very much. We are adjourned.